Welcome. This is the video lecture on consumer and producer surplus. I'm Professor Cherry. This is one of two video lectures that fall under welfare economics. Welfare economics is the study of the distribution and level of benefits generated by the markets. So it's a great framework to analyze markets but also policies, because it gives you insights about who benefits and who doesn't benefit, or the winners and losers of different policy prescriptions and different market arrangements. To do this, we have to have some metrics about how do you measure benefits. This is the focus of this video lecture, Consumer and Producer Surplus. So we're first going to look at the basics of what is consumer surplus. Then we're going to look at the consumer surplus and how it relates to the demand curve, and then how price changes affect consumer surplus. And we're going to do the same thing for producer surplus. Let's first look at the basics of consumer surplus. The definition of consumer surplus is simply the benefits that buyers receive by participating in the market. And it's measured by the amount the consumer is willing to pay minus the amount they actually pay, which can be simply written as consumer surplus equals WTP minus P. Right? So you can think of this consumer surplus measure as a profit for the buyer. Right? So imagine if you go to the store and you're going to buy a product and you're expecting to pay $10 for it. So you get there and you find out that it's only $5. It went on sale as half price. So you were willing to pay $10, maybe even more than $10. You were expecting to pay $10, maybe you were willing to pay more. But you actually paid less than your willingness to pay. Right? And that difference is the consumer surplus. It's the profit that the buyer received from the market transaction. Right? In a sense, the product gave you benefits worth what you're willing to pay, but you only paid for part of those benefits. So in a sense, that product gave you benefits that you didn't pay for. So that's the profit for buyers. And we'll go over a couple of examples later. So willingness to pay. More precisely, let's define it as the maximum amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good or service. And this is the buyer's value for that good or service. Here's an example. Suppose Jack and Jill go to the movie. Jack loves the movie and is willing to pay $12 to go. So Jack really enjoys going to the movie, gets a lot of benefits from it, enjoyment from it. Jill doesn't like movies as much, but is willing to go. She's willing to pay $10, right? So she likes movies, but not as much as Jack, which is revealed by their willingness to pay. The market price for a ticket is $8, right? So both of them have a willingness to pay above the market price, which we'll see later is an indicator that they'll probably be willing to buy the ticket. Right? So let's recall what consumer surplus is. It's willingness to pay minus price. So what we have, Jack's consumer surplus is 12 minus 8 is 4. Jill's consumer surplus is 10, willingness to pay of 10 minus the price of 8 is 2. So Jack's consumer surplus is $4, Jill's consumer surplus is $2. Right? So they both pay the same market price, but since Jack enjoys it a bit more than Jill, he has a higher consumer surplus from that transaction. So let's look at consumer surplus and how it relates to the demand curve, because that's going to be important in how we use consumer surplus. So let's consider that there's more than two people that want to go to the movie, right? But these people are going to have different preferences and different levels of enjoyment they get from the movie. So they're going to have different willingness to pay. Right, so let's suppose that we have these 6 individuals. Jack's willingness to pay is $12, Nash's willingness to pay is 11, Jill's 10, Rye's is 9, Alvy's 8, and Ollie's 7. We have 6 individuals, 6 people that were in the market to buy a movie ticket, and we have their different preferences based on their level of enjoyment they get out of the movie. right? So the first thing we want to do is organize all these buyers according to their willingness to pay, right? So I've organized it with Jack being first because his willingness to pay is the highest, and Ollie's is last because his is the lowest. And so we rank order those down in order. And we do that because that allows us to translate these willingness to pays to a demand curve. And here's how we do this. Now, remember the demand curve is downward sloping. Now think of the demand curve as each point on the demand curve represents a buyer. And if you arrange the buyers from highest willingness to pay to lowest willingness to pay, you have a downward sloping demand curve. And each point on the demand curve represents a willingness to pay. All right, so you have Jack's willingness to pay of 12 is represented by 1 point on the demand curve. And it's at the point of the demand curve where the price is 12. Nash, you do the same thing, where on the demand curve the price is 11, because that's Nash's willingness to pay is 11. Right, and you do that for everyone that's in the market, all the buyers that are in the market. So we stop at Ollie at 7, but you could consider there's more people that even have lower willingness to pays. And then you get down to the bottom where willingness to pay might be 0 for some people, because there are some people that don't enjoy going to the movie at all. So now let's graphically represent each person's consumer surplus on the demand curve. Right? So we have the concept of what consumer surplus is. So willingness to pay minus the market price. Right? So now let's look at that and see what that looks like graphically with the demand curve. So first, let's start with Jack's consumer surplus. Remember that his willingness to pay was 12 and the market price was 8. So that gives us Jack's consumer surplus of $4, and that's represented by this shaded area, this blue shaded area. And it represents consumer surplus because you take the point on the demand curve that was Jack at 12, and you go down to the market price, and the difference between the willingness to pay of 12 and the market price of 8 is the consumer surplus. So this is what you have. And if you want to, you could think of that blue shaded area as 4 squares, and each square represents $1. So now let's look at the next person, Nash. Remember, his willingness to pay was 11. So his point on the demand curve down to the price, and you shade in that area, and that's his consumer surplus. So now we can go to Jill. Remember, her willingness to pay was 10. So you take her point on the demand curve of 10, and then you take the difference between 10 and the market price of 8 and shade in that area. So that's Jill's consumer surplus of $2. And again, you can think of that rectangle as 2 squares, each representing $1. So now let's look at Rye's consumer surplus. Remember, his willingness to pay was $9. The market price is 8, so the consumer surplus for Rye is $1. And that's represented by that 1 square. Right? So you take 9 on the demand curve, his point on the demand curve, because his willingness to pay is 9, and you subtract 8 from it, and you end up with $1, represented by that 1 square. So we're not done yet though, right? So we have Alvy's consumer surplus to consider. Now Alvy's willingness to pay was 8, and the market price is 8. So what is Alvy's consumer surplus? It's 0. Right? So what does this mean? That means that if Alvy buys a movie ticket, the price he's paying is equal to his willingness to pay. So in essence, he has 0 buyer's profit or 0 consumer surplus. He's paying for all of the benefits that he's receiving from that purchase. So given his consumer surplus is 0, we can consider him as being indifferent between buying the ticket and not buying the ticket. Right? So whereas Rye, if he buys a ticket, he's $1 better off than he was without the ticket. Jill, she's $2 better off with the ticket than without the ticket, right? Because Jill, for instance, her willingness to pay was 10, right? She's buying the ticket for 8, but the ticket's actually giving her $10 worth of benefits. So she gets this extra $2 of benefits. Alvy doesn't have that situation. What he has is he's paying for $8 worth of benefits because his willingness to pay is 8, and he's paying $8 for it. So he's getting no additional benefit from the purchase. So he's just as well off without the ticket, keeping the $8, as he is with buying the ticket and the ticket giving him $8 worth of benefits. Now let's look at Ollie's consumer surplus. Remember, his willingness to pay is 7, but the price is 8. So if Ollie purchased the movie ticket, he would have a negative profit, or a consumer surplus of -1, because he paid $8 for a ticket, and the ticket only gave him $7 worth of benefits, or well-being, or happiness, right? So given that, that's a bad deal for Ollie, so he's not going to buy the ticket, right? So he's one of those buyers that would say, well, it's not worth it to me, I'll just keep my money. I'd rather have my money than go to the movie, right? So he chooses not to buy. And then if you go down the demand curve, maybe someone else has a $5 willingness to pay, a $3 willingness to pay, a $2 willingness to pay. All of those people face that same decision, and they're not going to buy. So now let's suppose that we have more than those 6 individuals. Suppose we add a number a bit more in between those. So instead of just having willingness to pay of 12, 11, and 10, maybe we add some people and there's someone that has a willingness to pay of $11.50 or $10.50, and maybe even add more where you have $10.20, and so it becomes more continuous. And then if you add more people and fill in the points on the demand curve in between the ones we just went through, those shaded bars become more narrow, right? And those little triangles get smaller and smaller. And if you do this and make it more continuous and keep adding people, then what you end up with is a completed shaded area, and it looks like this. So every point on the demand curve is a buyer. So you end up with this shaded area as a representation of consumer surplus. This triangle that is below the demand curve but above the price. That is the graphical representation of consumer surplus. So just to see how consumer surplus might change with a price change, we can first look at this mathematically, right? If we have consumer surplus is equal to willingness to pay minus price, then mathematically you can see that if you lower price, you're going to increase consumer surplus. If you increase price, you're going to lower consumer surplus, right? So we're essentially willingness to pay, the benefits you enjoy, or your happiness that you receive from a product or a service doesn't change. But if the price changes, your profit from buying that product or service does change, right? And if the price goes up, the cost goes up, it eats into your consumer surplus. And if the price goes down, you get greater benefits. Now, if you want to think about it intuitively, buyers benefit when prices fall, and buyers are hurt when prices rise. So now let's look at this graphically. So for a price increase, let's suppose that the example that we just had, where the market price is $8 for a movie ticket, and we have a shaded triangle that represents the consumer surplus. Now let's suppose that something happened, and it could be one of the things that we went through during supply and demand. Maybe there was a change in the market, a shift in the supply curve that caused prices to go up. If prices go up, that eats into consumer surplus, and we can see a smaller triangle because of that price increase. So now let's look at a price decrease, a before and after. Again, we start with the market with the price of 8. Now let's suppose that there's a change in the market and prices go down into $7. And we can see here that as prices go down, consumer surplus becomes larger. All right, now we're going to move to producer surplus. Producer surplus represents the benefits that the sellers receive by participating in the market. All right, so this definition looks similar to the consumer surplus definition. The only difference is that we're looking at the benefits that the sellers receive instead of the benefits the buyers receive. So it's going to look similar. We're going to go through it, but we're going to look at it from the seller's perspective over the supply side of the market. How do you measure producer surplus? That's the amount received by the seller minus the total cost of production, which is WTA, which we refer to as willingness to accept, which we'll define in a second. All right, so this can be written by the simple math equation: producer surplus equals price minus WTA. And this essentially is the profit for the seller. Right? So we talked about consumer surplus being the profit for buyers, and that's a little bit of a new concept for most people. This is the profit for sellers as we typically think of profit. Right? It's the price that they receive for selling something minus their costs. So let's define willingness to accept, WTA, a little bit more precisely. It's the minimum amount a seller is willing to take for a good or service. So it's the lowest price they're willing to accept to sell. And what is this? This is going to be their cost. So the lowest price they're willing to accept is going to be their cost. And you have to remember that this includes opportunity cost, not just the cost of production, but also the opportunity cost. For instance, automobile dealerships at the beginning of the new model year, they might sell at a discount, even might sell at a slight loss if you only consider the monetary cost of production. But there's an opportunity cost. If they have their old models on display, then that takes up space away from the newer models. So they would like to get rid of it. There's an opportunity cost of them having it on their showroom floor. So here's an example. Suppose the market price for a writing pen is $2.50. Bic has a cost of 50 cents in producing a pen. Pilot has a cost of $2 in producing a pen. Keeping in mind that producer surplus is price minus willingness to accept, we have Bic's producer surplus equal to $2.50 minus 50, the price minus their willingness to accept, the cost. So their producer surplus is $2. Pilot's producer surplus is $2.50, the price received, minus their cost, $2, or their willingness to accept. So that leaves them a profit of 50 cents per pen. Right? So Bic's producer surplus is $2, Pilot's producer surplus is 50 cents. So just as we did with the consumer surplus and how we related that to the demand curve, we're going to do the same thing here with producer surplus. We're going to relate it to the supply curve. So we can graphically represent producer surplus in the supply and demand model. So just as we did before, we're going to expand this example and consider more producers beyond Bic and Pilot. So let's say we have 6 producers of pens. Right, so we have Bic, who is the low-cost producer of 50 cents. Their willingness to accept. Topps has a willingness to accept of $1. Papermate, they have a willingness to accept or a cost of $1.50, and so forth, all the way down to Easton, who has a willingness to accept or a cost of $3.50. Right. So just as you did before, where you organize the buyers from highest willingness to pay to lowest willingness to pay, and you get this downward sloping demand curve. Here you're going to organize the sellers according to their cost of production. So you're going to have the low cost producers listed first, and you're going to organize them from low to high cost producers. So this is what it translates to in the supply curve. So BIC, BIC's willingness to accept is 50 cents, so they're at the bottom of the supply curve. The next step up is TOPS, which their cost is $1, and so forth, and you go up. So you've arranged the producers from low cost producers to high cost producers, and every point along that supply curve represents a producer. And again, just as before, you could think of, we're only looking at 6 producers, but you could add 6 more, 12 more, 50 or 100 producers, and each point you would fill in the points between the ones that we're going to be looking at. Now let's look at first BIC's producer surplus. Remember, BIC's cost was 50 cents. The market price is $2.50, so that leaves BIC with a producer surplus of $2. Right? The profit or producer surplus for BIC is $2. And that's represented by this shaded area, the price minus willingness to accept. So now let's move to TOPS producer surplus. Remember, TOPS willingness to accept was $1. Given the market price is $2.50, that leaves a producer surplus for TOPS of $1.50, and that's represented by the shaded area. Then you have Papermate. Their willingness to accept is $1.50, and with a price of $2.50, that means that Papermate's producer surplus is $1, and that's represented by that shaded area, 2 half-dollar squares. And then you have Pilot's producer surplus. Pilot's willingness to accept was $2. Given that the price was $2.50, that means that Pilot's producer surplus is 50 cents. $2.50 minus 2. And that's represented by that shaded area. Now let's look at Zipper's producer surplus. So Zipper has a willingness to accept of $2.50. Their cost is $2.50. The market price is $2.50. Right? So what they receive is the same as their cost, so their producer surplus is 0. Right? So they don't have any positive profit, but they don't have any negative profit either. So they don't gain anything or they don't lose anything by producing it. They've covered their cost perfectly, right? And no extra. So that means Zipper is essentially indifferent to producing the product. So let's look at Easton. Easton's willingness to accept is $3, which is higher than the market price of $2.50. So Easton is going to lose money if they produce, right? They're going to lose. They're going to have a producer surplus of negative 0.5. Right? So if that's the case, then Easton's going to decide not to produce. You have a negative profit essentially. So if they produce, they're going to end up worse off than they were before. So they're going to decide not to produce. So here what you see is everyone on the low side of the supply curve are lower cost producers, and their production costs are low enough that they're profitable. And then when you hit Zipper, that point and above that point, those producers their costs are high enough that if they produce, they would lose money, right? So they're high cost producers, and they would lose money if they produced and sold in this market. So again, we were looking at 6 producers. If you fill in the gaps between those 6 and have, like I said, 24, 50, or 100 producers, you can actually have each point on the supply curve being a producer. And then that shaded area becomes a clean triangle that's below the price but above the supply curve. And that triangle represents the producer surplus in that market. So let's look at price changes and the producer surplus. How does the price change affect producer surplus? So first, let's look at it mathematically. We know that producer surplus is the price minus willingness to accept. So just looking at this equation, you can see that if price goes up or down, what that does to producer surplus. If prices go down, that's going to decrease producer surplus. If prices go up, that's going to increase producer surplus. Now, intuitively, sellers are going to benefit when prices go up, and they're going to be harmed when prices go down. And that's because the price dictates what revenue they receive, and that revenue, more revenue is better than less revenue for the seller. That's the end of this video lecture. Please be sure to read the text and review your notes, and revisit parts of the video lecture if you have any questions or uncertainties.